for the Carmarthenshire Antiquarian Society on a project called Carmarthenshire Enlightenment, which tells the story of the fuller effects of Griffith Jones, who was vicar here in Carmarthenshire from 1716 to his death in 1761. I first met the lady that became my wife in 1970, and she and I were teachers, and she'd come from a farm just outside Larne, and so every year, for every holiday, 3 times a year, we would go and spend time on the farm and get to know the area around here. And that continued for well over 40 years, and then eventually we came to live here as well. And in all that time, nearly 50 years, I'd never heard of Griffith Jones. My first acquaintance was actually through the museum. We were walking past a portrait of Madame Bevan, and my colleague pointed out to her and said, she is probably the most significant woman in Welsh history, and she's from Larne. And I was just astonished. I'd never heard of her, and I don't think many of the people in Larne had heard of her either.
So what is her significance?
Well, she was a sponsor of Griffith Jones. She was very wealthy, and she continued the schools that he started after his death, and in the 18 years that she did that, she actually exceeded the number of pupils and the number of schools that he'd managed to create, phenomenal though they were, and then left £10,000, which became, after Chancery court case, £30,000, which continued to fund schools. They were called the Madame Bevan Charity Schools in the first instance, but then became the national schools of the church, and in fact the funds still fund schools by the church. There had been schools, and the latest ones in Griffith Jones' time were the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, the SPCK schools, and he was a teacher in one of them. In around 1730, he says he developed a sort of question and answer sequence with his parishioners, gently probing their understanding, and realised that despite 15 years of preaching sermons to them, their understanding, in his terms, was very limited of what Christianity was all about. And so he decided that unless people actually read for themselves the Bible and prayer book and catechism, they would not enter heaven. So he decided to try and teach people to read in the school here, and it was very successful. Within a couple of months they were able to read more independently, and so he then invited other parishes around to have the same experience, to share the idea, and that was successful too. And so he turned a house opposite the church here into a hostel for mostly young men to come and stay, and then another cottage in the village here into a college. It's still called Revd College, and taught mostly men to go and teach people to read wherever they were invited. One of the phenomenal things about this was that they were teaching in Welsh, or nearly all previously education had been in English. So it was in Welsh, which they could understand. It was helpful because Welsh is a very phonetic language. The symbols match the sounds, so that enabled it to happen much more quickly. And the other phenomenal thing about it was to everyone, boys, of course, and girls. That was an innovation, and adults, and even further innovation. And this is what the young men went out to do. There were some women later on, certainly involved as teachers too. And this really became an attractive proposition, presumably, for parishes all over Wales, because in time, over his 30 years, it's estimated that something around half the population of Wales had been taught to read, and then Madam Bevan continued the organisations of the schools, as well as funding many of them, for another 18 years, and more than doubling that number. So possibly 350,000 out of a population, maybe more, because they didn't include, they kept a register but of the day students, but they didn't include the evening classes numbers, and so we don't really know the numbers, but they were at least 350,000 out of a population of Wales of about 450,000. How much of an incentive did that give to the national school movement as a whole? And so that could be a further legacy. But at the time, I suppose his greatest legacy, which we haven't mentioned, was his phenomenal ability to preach. He was attracting, presumably here, anything up to, so it was recorded, 3,000 people to his sermons. Where they came from, how they got here, we're not really very clear. Many of them would have walked. But that inspired lots of other preachers, lots of other young men to go out and preach. William Williams, Pantycellion, Peter Williams, David Charles, Thomas Charles, lots of them, all from Carmarthenshire, well, nearly all from Carmarthenshire, and that then led to an upsurge in attendance. Well, attendance at meetings, which were often in people's houses, because sadly the church often didn't encourage these young men because they were, well, some said, too enthusiastic, or were preaching in the open. But then sometimes, well, Griffith Jones often had to preach in the open because they couldn't all fit in the church. And they preached in public places and not on Sundays. And so eventually they presumably got frustrated by not being accepted by the established church, and formed their own church, that was called the Calvinistic Methodist Church, now the Presbyterian Church of Wales. And they experienced a boom time. Churches throughout Wales, the established churches throughout Wales, also experienced growth. The publication that Griffith Jones produced, called Welsh Piety, every year listed the schools that had opened, so we've got records, and the pupils that attended them, but also published reports from the person in the parish, which was usually the vicar, who was talking about the effect of the schools, and many of them expressed the details, that numbers grew, enthusiasm grew, the behaviour became better, and the morals improved. So a fantastic range of legacy. But in addition to that, perhaps some might say that the greatest one was all the teaching was in Welsh, or the publications that they distributed. I haven't mentioned those, but Griffith Jones persuaded the SPCK to produce a smaller version of the Bible for people to have in their homes, and he either funded them completely or partially to give out to people because they couldn't afford to buy them themselves. And presumably some of that money came from Madam Bevan, who also introduced it to other sponsors, mostly in England. The publications, the Bible, the main ones were the Bible, the Catechism and the Prayer Book. But in addition, Griffith Jones wrote 35 books. He was the most prolific author up to then in Britain. And many others joined in. And these were all in Welsh. So people not only learnt to read, but had lots of literature, or religious literature to read.
Now, the Griffith Jones is just one part of a wider project that you have created, I suppose. Tell us about the Carmarthenshire Enlightenment.
Well, the mission of it, if you like, was to get the story, the heritage, known more widely locally and perhaps beyond. So we've produced a book, and there are a number of places around, including Llanddowell Church, which have features in them which link to the story. Obviously, one here is the grave of Griffith Jones, and there's a plaque outside. And then there are 8 places like this with elements of that story to be told, and so we've built a tour of those 8 places using history points, QR plaques on each of them to link them up and to make the information available so people can. They're all on the outside of the buildings, and so people can read the QR and get a fuller picture of some of the aspects of the story at each place. The tour really begins here in Llanddowell, with the plaque outside, and if they can get access, to come in and see the church. And there are memorials on the walls to Griffith Jones and to Madam Bevan. And then it goes on to Eglwys Church, where Peter Williams was curate for just a year before being ejected for his enthusiasm. And in there is a Bible presented, the first edition of the Peter Williams Bible, because he produced an annotated version of the Bible, which became hugely popular and widely sold. And in there's a little exhibition of one of those presented by Madam Bevan to one of her nieces. So it's a rather precious memento there. And then on to Pendine. At Pendine, there's a chapel called the Peter Williams Memorial Chapel, because he was born close by, and 100 years after his death, this chapel was erected to his memory. And they have artifacts from Peter Williams inside, which can be on display at times. And then on to Larne, and St Martin's Church in Larne was where Griffith Jones gained really his first prolonged curacy for 5 years in 1709, before being appointed here. So, and then in the last 5 or 6 years of his life, he returned to Larne to live in Madam Bevan's house, presumably looked after by her servants in these final years. And then it goes on to St Clair's, where there is a building which was a farmer's market, and it's being turned into a community centre. So it houses exhibitions, and one of them is about the project. But it was built in the garden of the farm next door called Penton Farm, and that had housed one of the first of the circulating charity schools in that area. There were 46 altogether in that location, which must have been one of the busiest of them over time. And then on to Carmarthen and Revd Chapel, now becoming a community centre. It's closed as a chapel, and that was the site of the home of Peter Williams when he was living in Carmarthen, to supervise the production of the Bible. And he built, well, his home presumably was first of all a place for assembly and worship, but then he built the chapel in the garden, and then gradually that chapel, or the numbers attending that chapel, grew and grew, and so the chapel had to grow and grow. So it's now an enormous set of buildings, but started by Peter Williams. And then the final place on the tour is at Llanfaelog, where the church is, the church burial ground is where Peter Williams' his final resting place is, and again inside the church there's one of Peter Williams' first edition Bibles on display.